You know, some people enjoy composing their own music, chord by chord, and others are happiest when they come across that one perfect song. Work is not a lot different than that. Whether you prefer building your own workflow or using a pre-made template, with Monday.com, you and the team can work in a way that's comfortable for everyone. Tap the banner to go to Monday.com and build your own amazing workflow, or find an awesome template. No judgment.
At Evernorth Health Services, we believe costs shouldn't get in the way of life-changing care, and we're doing everything in our power to make it possible. Behavioral health solutions that also keep your projections at their best? It's possible. Pharmacy benefits that benefit your bottom line? It's possible. Complex specialty care that cares about your ROI? It's possible. Because we're already doing it. All while saving businesses billions. That's Wonder made possible. Learn more at evernorth.com/wonder.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 471, My Tank is Thicker Than Your Tank. The Battle of Kiev during the summer of 1941 was one of Hitler's greatest victories, Pyrrhic though it may have been, and yet it was only a stepping stone on the way to Moscow. There was still much work to do. But a feature of the war in the East had just begun. Namely, larger than expected German or Axis casualties, deaths of experienced or true believers that could not be replaced. So, though Germany advanced, it became weaker, literally, and in terms of nationalistic fiber, and the Battle of Kiev certainly helped that process along. To be sure, the objectives or priorities of when such and such city would fall changed several times during 1941. At first, it started with the idea of a coup de grace, namely a drive on Moscow, in where the center of the Soviet system would be captured, and perhaps Stalin as well. Thus, Army Group Center was the largest of the three groups with the most panzers. And just before Kiev was reached, Army Group Center had celebrated surrounding and capturing 600,000 enemy soldiers, which would normally be the end for that combatant. But not Stalin's Russia. He would keep ordering his men forward to their deaths, anything to stop this Teutonic tidal wave from reaching the outskirts of Moscow. And because of Stalin's extremist view of how to wage war, German casualties far exceeded predictions. For example, during the first 9 days of fighting of Barbarossa, the Germans lost 25,000 men, and that number would only rise during the next 2 months, with at least another 63,000 wounded. And whether it was the casualty count or economics, Hitler fancied himself a bit of a specialist in the latter. Just before Kiev was to be on Army Group Center's hit list, a rupture appeared in Army headquarters. As Army Group Center had most of everything, it was ahead of the other two army groups. Thus, the Army General Staff wanted it to press on to Moscow and hopefully end this enormous endeavor. But Hitler saw something else when looking at a map, or rather, he saw more than just the battlefield. Instead of pushing on to Moscow, he wanted Army Group Center to help the other two army groups. Why? To the north, to Hitler's way of thinking, Leningrad was the center of Bolshevism, and if it was destroyed, the Soviet political system might just die with it. In the south, the goal was more tangible, namely resources. The ability of Ukraine to grow much-needed crops, and of course the oil fields in southern Russia. Either way, there was now a standoff between Hitler and his generals about the second phase of Barbarossa. In the end, Hitler won, but the argument did tie up specific orders going out between July 21st and August 23rd. Just before August was over, Der Führer declared that Panzer Group II, of the southern wing of Army Group Center, would turn further south and make for the Ukraine, thus setting the stage for the largest and most bloody battle fought so far in the war. Back on June 22, 1941, Stalin had a Douglas MacArthur moment, if you will, the latter being shocked into inaction when he was told that the Japanese had attacked the Philippines, Or perhaps MacArthur had a Stalin moment when his country was invaded. In both instances, both men felt good about their chances, if just given a bit more time. Indeed, Stalin had sent Molotov, his foreign minister, to Berlin after France fell just a bit too quickly to try to hold off any invasion of his country before winter set in. Because by 1942, Stalin felt he would be in much better shape to resist by then, but neither Stalin nor MacArthur got any extra time that they craved. 6 days into Barbarossa, the city of Minsk fell, and soon the Russian people were put on notice when Stalin had 3 of the commanders at Minsk, who survived, executed. Between this and the general cruelty of the invaders, the Russian people realized it was better to fight to the death than any other option. So they did, and Nazi Germany felt the effects of it. If there was anyone still not on board with Stalin's new philosophy, he cleared that up in July, telling his people, "It is time to finish retreating, not one step back. Such should now be our main slogan. Henceforth, the solid law of discipline for each commander, Red Army soldier, and commissar should be the requirement, not a single step back without order from higher command." Setting his own tone for the upcoming battle, Hitler had the declaration of war delivered to Moscow several hours after the fighting had started. There was to be no mercy, no understanding of the proper rules of warfare. It was to be the survivor takes all, and in that vein there were to be few to no rules of how to obtain that victory.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
As noted, Army Group Center first took Minsk, then Smolensk, and taking advantage of the captured Soviet railway cars and rail lines, at first kept up with the logistical needs of this dagger into the enemy's heart. But as Smolensk was being invested, Hitler ordered panzers from Army Group South to head either north or south. Thus, General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II, the largest panzer group, was to offer assistance in the Ukraine. Of course, that meant Moscow would be safe for the immediate future, but there was other ways of winning. It's unclear if Hitler's thoughts at this moment were becoming less focused, but his forces in Russia certainly were. Still, starting out well enough, the Germans of Army Group Center had advanced hundreds of miles in the opening days of Barbarossa. In truth, Stalin realized by 1941 that he had immeasurably hurt himself with his purges between 1936 and 1938, so spent the first half of 1941 trying to do nothing to trigger the Nazi state. But Hitler had already decided his course of action. When Smolensk fell on July 16th, Army Group Center had already covered 440 miles, unheard of numbers compared to the Great War, and were now 66% of the way to Moscow. As for the Smolensk pocket, created as Soviet troops tried to defend the city, that was eliminated by August 5th. Thus, another 3,200 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, 1,000 planes, and just over 300,000 Soviet POWs were now in German hands. With Smolensk in hand, German forces drove another 50 miles or 80 kilometers to the east-southeast of that captured town to take Yelnya. Why? Well, one, a salient in the Russian line was needed to help launch the next phase, and two, everyone in Army Group Center assumed they would be continuing on to the east-northeast towards Moscow. But Hitler was about to alter that course and the course of the war. There had been talk of sending General Hoth and his panzers from Army Group Center to the north to help subdue Leningrad. But in the end, the generals around Hitler convinced him to keep them where they were. And their best argument was that, as far as they could tell, the enemy had relatively few tanks between Smolensk and Moscow at this time. And thanks to Luftwaffe raids, the Russians also had few vehicles as well. Now was the time to keep moving forward, and Hitler would agree, but without Guderian's Panzer II Group, that was to help finish off Kiev and get control of the Ukraine. The official order for Guderian to head south was cut on August 3rd, but even by then, Army Group South was doing well, driving east and making for Kiev. Within its fold were 46.5 divisions of about 700,000 men. There was also 2 SS divisions, which had the latest and best of everything handed to them, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the Viking Division, though the latter was also made up of Danes, Norwegians, Flemings, and Dutch soldiers. Opposing all this was Stalin's southwestern front of about 907,000 men and about 4,000 tanks. The immediate commander of all this was Colonel General Kurpanos, who knew what he was doing. He certainly knew more than his boss, Regional Commander Bunyene, or for that matter, Nikita Khrushchev, the Kiev area's political commissar. Fortunately, Khrushchev got along with Kurpanos. After Minsk was taken, the Germans continued on with their blitzkrieg tactics to keep moving east. Bombers or fighters would fly over the enemy's main defensive line and attack those commanding those troops. In the ensuing confusion, fast-moving panzers or mechanized infantry would hit the flanks and then circle to meet up, cutting off or surrounding a massive part of the enemy's line. Then, after being reinforced, this encirclement would be reduced, mostly through artillery and air attacks. As the Germans had this down to a science by now, they were able to move on, as in, once a portion of the enemy was surrounded, many of the panzers that helped create this would move on to the next victim. In such a way, cities like Vinnytsia and Lviv soon fell. The Ukraine had been pierced. And yet, upon leaving Belarus and entering the Ukraine, the first thing the Germans noticed was a lack of proper roads and relatively fewer rail lines. Worse, though Army Group Center had its own team to build rail lines to support it, Army Group South did not, and had to make do with what was to hand. And what was to hand was a single working rail line. And this worked for now, but it would not work once Army Group South crossed the Dnieper River, which Kiev straddles across. One officer, General Gotthard Heinrizi of the Fourth Army under Kluge, wrote, "There are only a few major roads, and all by-road bridges are destroyed. The weather is still very warm. The roads are finally solid, instead of being sandy like in Belarus. They are clay here in the Ukraine." That, though, would change as the summer faded to autumn. Ironically, Kurpanos' southwest front had a lion's share of Soviet Russia's tanks, as Stalin believed the true thrust would come through here, southwest of Moscow, and he seemed correct. But from day one, Stalin ordered counterattacks, and Kurpanos obeyed, sending his precious tanks in, driven and led by inexperienced tank crews. And here's the ironic part. As the T-34s, KV-1 and KV-2s came in, they were attacked by Panzer III tanks and the like, but the German shells rarely penetrated the Russian tanks, which, it turned out, they did not have to. As the Russian tank crews were so unnerved by these tanks, they turned around of their own volition. Some were executed afterwards. So much for learning from their mistakes. One German tank commander noted, "Even though at this short distance every shot was a hit, the Russians drove on without much visible effect. Despite repeated hits, our fire had no effect. It appears as if shells were simply bouncing off. The enemy tanks disengaged without fighting and retreated." That would change in time, but stories like this certainly helped the invaders believe this would all be over by Christmas. When the Ukraine was first entered by the Germans, a Major General Ogorsov ordered 100 tanks and 2 battalions of motorized infantry to attack Panzer Regiment 15. The Germans saw the Russian tanks coming their way, but were steadied by artillery fire and anti-tank guns. The first on the scene were some light T-26 tanks and armored cars. The German artillery and anti-tank rifles made quick work of these. Then a second wave of Russian tanks emerged on the scene. This time, it was the early model T-34 tanks. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, not outfitted with guns that they would have in the future, were unable to take out the approaching enemy tanks. Luckily, a few of the Russian tanks were stopped by German artillery shells hitting their tracks, but their guns still worked, so still posed a threat. Then a German officer realized something, or got lucky with a shot, as he ordered grenade launchers, but only at very close range, to aim for the fuel drums on the tank's rear deck. It set the vehicle ablaze and did more damage than the Panzers could, but a victory, however ugly, is still a victory. Point is, the Russians, in trying to follow orders to counterattack, but at the same time leaving something in reserve, would send in numerous but small groups of tanks against the Germans. These groupings were small enough to be dealt with, but did nothing to stop the Germans and only wasted what the defenders had. This was repeated throughout June and in the opening days of July, so by the time Kiev was threatened, there wasn't much left in the cupboard, certainly not as much as there had been. It didn't help that there was a Southwestern Front Corps commissar named Vashugin, whose incompetence was matched by his cruelty and massive insecurity, certainly when dealing with his own people. First, he would make accusations of cowardice in the face of an enemy, which brought in the NKVD. Then he would order a reckless counterattack that did nothing but get more Russians killed and their equipment destroyed. And perhaps Vashugin drank too much of his own Kool-Aid, as the saying goes, because before too long, he would commit this same mistake in sending in relatively small groups of tanks, but would end up hurting himself. In time, Stalin would take away such powers from the political commissars, as he needed competency more than loyalty. Only when it was clear that Mother Russia would survive Barbarossa would they return to their positions of power. Just days into Barbarossa, Moscow attempted to turn the tables on the invaders. On June 27th, von Kleist's Panzer Group I, working with the infantry of Hyacinth von Strachwitz, was fighting in a stretched-out line that went from Dubno to Brodny, located about 60 miles or 96 kilometers northeast of Lvov, now Lviv. The Soviet idea, and remember this is early on in the war, was to take some 3,500 tanks of the 10th Tank Division and put them with 5 mechanized corps and altogether surround this part of Army Group South. If this wing could be surrounded and annihilated, then Army Group South would have to come to a halt to redeploy and reconsider what to do next. The fighting started on June 30th. Taking on thousands of Soviet tanks were 750 Panzers. And this had better work for Moscow, as the 3,500 Soviet tanks represented half of the existing heavy tanks currently operational. When the Soviet forces came, their initial dash caught the Germans off guard. The first clashes saw the destruction of German tanks, trucks, and men. Now, it was just a matter of holding this entire enterprise together and coordinating to reduce the enemy one unit at a time. But that's not what happened. Radio communication was poor among the various Soviet units. Hell, their tanks had no radios, only the tank commander did, and if his tank was taken out, then it was down to yelling at each other from the top hatch. This allowed the Germans, bit by bit, to reorganize and focus what remained. And they did, in their turn, what the Soviets should have been doing, working together to obliterate a unit before moving on to the next. And unfortunately, the Soviet units couldn't help each other, because few, if any, really knew what was going on. They certainly did not know the larger picture. Working together, the Stuka dive bombers gathered in large groups and went after the thousands of enemy tanks. In only one day, 201 Soviet tanks were destroyed, and this pace would continue. Soon the Soviet vehicles of all kinds were harassed by teams of anti-tank guns, artillery, and air attacks working together. It took time, but the Germans were reviving their glory days of France, taking out the enemy in staggering numbers and then bragging each night before starting it all over again. An element of this successful defense was due to Hitler, who ordered that practically every 88 gun in Germany at the time was to be a part of Barbarossa. And the gun crews soon figured out that there was little else besides them that could take out the KV-1 and KV-2 tanks. Soon, the artillery crews were very popular, and many free drinks were promised to them after this was all over. The momentum that brought victory quickly swung to the Germans, but there was still hope, as there was still an impressive number of Soviet tanks, men, and guns. Lieutenant General Dmitry Rybashiev contacted what parts of the 8th Army Corps he could on June 28th. His plan was to charge directly at Dubno, the city furthest east of this local fight, and smash into the Germans there. Again, if they, the Germans, could be pushed back or wiped out, then the front would have to be restabilized. But that's when Commissar Vashugin stepped in. The power-hungry Vashugin went to Rybashiev's headquarters and said, "Do not wait for reinforcements. Attack now." The lieutenant general, knowing more about modern warfare than the commissar, said, "I need to wait for reinforcements. Taking the town is only the first phase. The Germans will counterattack. I need my flanks covered, and I need reserves." But Vashugin did not want to hear this. Having played this game before, the commissar knew how to get his way. He said to Rybashiev, "How much did you sell yourself for, Judas?" Rybashiev, taken aback by the false accusation, tried to reply, "Comrade Corps Commissar, if you would hear me out." But the political officer shot back, "You will be heard by military tribunal, traitor. Right here, under this tree, we'll hear you out, and right here, we'll shoot you." Now, Rybashiev had two choices. He could be tried and then most certainly shot, or he could take what he had and charge on Dubno. He chose the latter. Taking what he had of the 8th Motorized Corps, which included 303 tanks, of which almost 100 of them were T-34s and KV tanks, they went into action. Waiting for them was the 16th Panzer Division, supported by the 57th and 75th Infantry Divisions. The two sides clashed, but the Germans were set up for defense, and their 88s certainly contributed. Before too long, the 8th Motorized Corps fell back after losing 100 tanks. But even before the defeated Soviet force could pull back to headquarters, Vashugin met them and took command. He ordered the 200 or so remaining tanks forward with all possible infantry. But not knowing the terrain, he led them into a swamp. At first, the tanks slowed down, but then stopped. Then, they began to sink. The crews had to climb out and be rescued, or they would have disappeared with those tanks. Fortunately, 43 of the tanks stopped before reaching the swamp. Vashugin had lost 150 of his country's tanks, and the Germans did not have to fire nary a shot. Vashugin was beside himself with shame, guilt, but mostly fear. According to Khrushchev, the future Soviet leader, this is what happened next. Vashugin said, "I have decided to shoot myself." Khrushchev, "What are you talking about?" Vashugin, "I am guilty of giving incorrect orders to the commanders of the Mechanized Corps. I don't want to live any longer." Khrushchev, "Why are you talking foolishness? If you've decided to shoot yourself, what are you waiting for?" Here, Khrushchev stops the narrative and explains, "I wanted to jolt him with some sharp words." Back to the story, Khrushchev goes on, but he suddenly pulled out his pistol, put it to his temple, fired, and fell. It has to be said, the soldiers of the Ukraine were not too displeased by this event and actually fought better, not being interfered with by someone who had no idea what they were talking about, but had the power of life and death over everyone. With the Battle of Dubno over, the Germans got the huge fuel depot within the town, and though they had lost some 200 tanks in recent fighting, the vast majority of these would be repaired in time to rejoin the fight at Kiev. as opposed to the 800 tanks lost by the Soviets. As they were now behind the battle line, they remained where they were. Besides avoiding a local defeat, the Germans had gained the open space they needed to continue on, but also to deploy the blitzkrieg tactics. There was still much fighting to do, not at least to keep up with Army Group Center. But the way to Kiev was more open than before, thanks in part to Commissioner Vashugin and his desire to be a hero. Next time, Commissar Nikita Khrushchev takes what time he has left to build up the defenses around Kiev. Again, as the city sits on the Dnieper River, the area around it has swamps and marshes, which is a good start to keeping the Germans away. However, it also makes improving defenses equally challenging. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, as you can tell, we have started with our mini Kiev series, and then we'll go back to Moscow. So I just want to say hi and welcome aboard to a couple of people, and then I have an announcement. Let's see here. My latest members who get 2 episodes a month, but it's looking like 3 or 4 episodes a month just because I've gotten to a rhythm. Anyway, let's see here. Joseph Plord from China, wait for it, Maine. I thought that was cool. Brent Warren from Spicewood, Texas. Johannes Winyan from Greenpoint, New South Wales, Australia. And Mark 80 from London, UK, the gentleman that I recently interviewed about his father's experiences. The book is From Biplanes to Fast Jets. Trust me, you will love the book. You will love the photos and the diagrams in there. So check that out when you get a chance. As far as those who have donated, let's see here. Mark Foldy, Elinka Iliscu, and Ehud Barzilai. I hope I said that right. I apologize. I'm sure I did not get that right. So anyways, let's see here. Where do I start? So I will be, my family and I will be taking a trip to Europe this summer. Our daughter Kiki has graduated. A family members of Heather's has also graduated, and they have generously allowed us or asked us, did we want to go with them, fitting the bill. So we said, yes, please. So anyways, late June, early July, for at least a week in July, we'll be gone. We're going to hit Paris, Florence, and then Athens, I think. Anyway, yeah, when they do it right. So anyways, I've got a couple of standalone episodes in line for you guys, so you won't have to go without for the 2 or 2.5 weeks that I'll be gone. And I think you're going to enjoy them. I have some guests coming on, and we're going to have a lot of fun. So look forward to that. Anyways, I just wanted to let you know, so no matter where I'm at in the Kiev story arc, and again, it won't be as long as the Odessa one, I'll have to put those in just because I won't be here. So not to confuse anybody, but this is to give you a heads up. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy the Kiev episodes, and I hope you enjoy the 2 or 3 special little episodes standalone that I have coming up. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. As always, be safe, have a great summer, and take care, everyone.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.